You couldn't make Blazing Saddles today. If you're like me, you may have read or heard this phrase so many times that your brain just sort of glosses over it. It occupies the same space in my head as an ancient family mantra or time-worn platitude, something that conjures up no real emotion but whose old words hold just enough staying power to be regurgitated when appropriate. 2 in the hand is worth 1 in the bush. The grass is always greener on the other side. You couldn't make Blazing Saddles today. Rather than its own point, it's almost become a kind of punctuation mark at the end of the thought, a call to arms that bemoans the state of modern cinema. Those who espouse it usually do so to express the belief that people are just too sensitive today, that a controversial, edgy, witty, and cerebral comedy like Blazing Saddles wouldn't be accepted by today's sensitive and coddled audience, that there was a time when movies were like this. They weren't afraid to offend people, a joke was just a joke, and a movie was just a movie. You couldn't make Blazing Saddles today. And the funny thing is, as rote and played out as these words are, well, they're true. You really couldn't make Blazing Saddles today, but not for the reasons most people think. In fact, I think that the sentiment does the film and its legacy a huge disservice. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Blazing Saddles, its place in film history, and what it means to cinema today. Hopefully, by the time I'm done, I will have made my point that I think a far more fitting phrase would be, why would you make Blazing Saddles today?
You couldn't make a Mel Brooks movie today. No, it's all Blazing Saddles yesterday.
To say that Blazing Saddles was influential is misunderstanding its impact and place in film history, I think. Blazing Saddles was influential in the way a bulldozer or bomb is influential. The film didn't seek to inspire future works so much as to bring a hatchet down on an entire cinematic language, leaving it completely broken and unrecognizable thereafter. The film deconstructed and mocked a certain style of Western so mercilessly and effectively that it stopped fucking existing. Not to downplay the importance of other films in the genre, but it's pretty easy to draw a line between pre- and post-Blazing Saddles westerns. To understand exactly what Blazing Saddles did, it's best we take a look at that pre-category first. You've probably heard of the Hays Code, a series of moral guidelines that came into being in the 1930s and more or less dictated what Hollywood was allowed to portray in movies. For nearly 40 years, the notoriously strict Hays Code discouraged studios from including in their films such moral debauchery as sympathetic villains, positive examples or discussions of divorce, the silhouette of someone in the nude, and beds that can accommodate more than one person. If a film was bold enough to depict a large bed, chances are it wouldn't dare show 2 people lying in it at the same time. This is why, in so many old movies, one member of a couple is sitting on the bed or has one foot placed squarely on the ground. If there wasn't a foot on the ground, the audience would think about sex. Today it's easy to look at the Hays Code as stupidly strict or blatantly primitive, but consider that the guidelines restricting film at the time were downright lax compared to those affecting broadcast media. Allow me to introduce the Television Code, effective March 1st, 1952. The Television Code included such rules as priests are to be treated respectfully and not to be mocked. The consumption of alcohol should only be shown if it's directly relevant to the plot. Criminals and criminal activity was always to be portrayed as unsympathetic. Members of law enforcement must always be portrayed positively. Oh, and maybe most mind-bogglingly, it was frowned upon to shock the viewer. To shock the viewer. Let that one sink in. As it was entirely possible for a child to change the channel and happen upon any given broadcast, every TV show, even those intended for adults, had to follow another series of guidelines for what was acceptable to show children. If you've ever wondered why so many old TV shows like Leave It to Beaver feel so tame, this is why. It may also explain why so many old TV shows feel, I don't know, kind of propaganda-y?
You know, Dad, it's funny.
What's funny?
Well, whenever we cook inside, Mom always does the cooking. But whenever we cook outside, you always do it. How come?
Well, it's sort of traditional, I guess. You know, they say a woman's place is in the home, and I suppose as long as she's in the home, she might as well be in the kitchen.
Oh. Oh.
Needless to say, these limitations were severe. They heavily impacted not only the kinds of TV shows that could make it to air, but also the tones of those shows. There isn't very much room for realism, melancholy, or doubt when every TV show has to cater to hypothetical children. Naturally, the genre these guidelines had the most effect on was the most popular genre on TV at the time, which was the Western. I cannot overstate this enough. It is difficult to imagine how popular serialized Westerns were in the 50s and 60s. These days, it's the superhero genre that is most likely to be accused of oversaturation, but it's important to understand that nothing has ever held such a monopoly over the American zeitgeist as the Western once did. This year, there have been 7 shows on the air based on Marvel properties, which sounds like a lot. In 1958 alone, there were 50 Western TV shows on the air. There were 4 channels and 50 Westerns. And all of them had to follow the television code. Every single one of those shows presented a world where nobody swore, few people drank, the bad guys were cartoonishly villainous, and the lawmen always virtuous. These shows were not allowed to be historically accurate. History was not child-friendly. This meant that sensitive material had to be ignored or sugar-coated. The only way these shows really had to deal with topics like racism was, surprise surprise, to mention it as little as possible. A character could talk about the Civil or Sioux War, but they sure as hell weren't going to talk about the mass abuse of slaves or Native American genocide. In reality, the job of a cowboy was, well, it was lame as hell, but it didn't require too much formal training, and it was extremely plentiful work. This meant that there was no real shortage of black, Native American, or Mexican cowboys. We didn't end up seeing too many characters like that on TV, though. They didn't really sell. Plus, writing around racism is a lot harder to do when you have a minority leading man.
Buffalo Bill Jr. Buffalo Bill Jr.
Racism being institutional or ingrained into the societal fabric of the time wasn't very feel-good. Presenting the topic that way may also clash with law enforcement shall be upheld and the officers of the law are to be portrayed with respect and dignity. This meant that even if a show wanted to teach an anti-racist message, the safest way to do so was in the defeat of a single bad individual. You see, Chester may shoot this native man who's stealing a horse, but he nurses him back to health because Chester is a cowboy, and cowboys are stand-up guys. You see this bad man? He's a racist. He's not a cowboy. He's one bad egg. This bad man is mistreating his native prisoner, which is no good, so the just, honourable folks of Wagon Train Town decide to save her and spare her from barbaric Apache justice. They're even willing to die protecting her. This guy was just a bad egg. This one guy, he's a racist, but our leads, these handsome cowboys, they're cool. They're cool guys. What's with all these bad eggs in the Old West ruining the honourable cowboy name? A whole hen house of bad eggs, it seems. Though it's debatable as to whether this was the overt intent of such shows, they ended up presenting a thoroughly whitewashed, sanitized, child-friendly, and dishonest depiction of the American frontier. It was a world where the bad guys wore black and stood on one side of the screen, while the good guys wore white and stood to the other. It was a world designed simple enough to be passed by a child watching it on the crummiest black and white TV on the market. Both the era and the genre became synonymous with a certain idealized image of the country, where honest men tamed and brought civility to a wild land through the sheer hardiness of the American character.
Quiet earth, brave, courageous, and bold. Long live his fame, and long live his glory, and long may his story be told.
A world where every town was full of good, honest, hard-working folk with an unbreakable sense of community. It was, as I'll refer to it from now on, the wholesome West. Sure, there were more adventurous westerns in cinema at the time, but by and large, they weren't what children, or rather, the whole family, were watching together. They weren't what kids were talking about at school, they weren't the most affordable option, and they weren't the safe media that parents felt comfortable letting their kids watch. The effect of this was an entire generation of kids brought up on a western that was wholesome, family-friendly, morally uncompromised, and thoroughly white. To them, the primary West was a wholesome West. Then, when they were in their 20s, they saw Blazing Saddles.
Hey, where are the white women at?
A film that not only featured a black main character, but depicted the cruelty, ugliness, and hypocrisy of the Old West. Blazing Saddles was calling out the very idea of a wholesome West, and in doing so, highlighting just how farcical the very notion was. The film makes its intentions clear right off the bat, opening with the exact kind of schmaltzy theme song you might expect from the genre. It wants you to be thinking of this kind of wholesome West when, within minutes, it's breaking the fourth wall and comparing the era to the Dark Ages. The world was so unprepared for Blazing Saddles that Mel Brooks once recalled having to fight tooth and nail to keep something as mundane as a fart joke in the movie. Cowboys can't fart, they're the symbol of American exceptionalism, rugged and cultured men who tamed an untamable land and brought modernity and civilization to a vast and incomprehensible frontier. They're the mythical, idealized, refined yet masculine avatar of the entire American spirit. Not only did these cowboys fart, but they did so with ill intent. These cowboys were not only unclean, they were dishonorable, stupid, selfish, and explicitly bigoted. It wasn't just the bad guys either. It was the typically humble, sweet-natured townsfolk. Which, of course, brings us to race. Of all the things Blazing Saddles said and did to the wholesome Western, nothing was as thoroughly rattling as the casting of a black lead character. If you want to understand the entire ethos of Blazing Saddles, all you have to do is sit down and watch a wholesome Western, with its cheesy, family-oriented depictions of honest lawmen and humble townsfolk set to a quaint little soundtrack, and ask one simple question. How would a black character be experiencing this story?
And I'm going to prove it.
Really, once you ask that question, so many of these serials become impossible to take seriously. If you know and try to depict the history of the era in a film with that kind of tone, how can the finished product end up as anything other than farce? How can you take any trope of the genre at face value?
We'll head them off at the pass!
Head them off at the pass? I hate that cliche.
The studio absolutely hated and were afraid of this idea, to the point where they begged Mel Brooks to rewrite and recast the film with a white lead. This is what Blazing Saddles does so well. It takes a fairly unextraordinary story of a quaint little town beset by bandits and a corrupt old railroad tycoon and places a black man at center stage. Suddenly, the racism, cruelty, and dirtiness of the era can't be swept under the rug for the sake of convenience. The film can't pretend the world, town, or people therein are anything other than they are.
Morons.
The film even ends by drawing attention to the genre's artificiality in one of the most wonderfully camp fourth wall breaking finales ever put to film. And as those studio execs may have expected, this conceit broke the Western genre. Or a part of it, at least. After seeing and understanding the point Blazing Saddles was making, audiences could no longer take depictions of the wholesome West seriously. So effective was Blazing Saddles' deconstruction that the subgenre started to die out. Sincere examples of the wholesome Western became increasingly rare, and revisionist Westerns, which attempted to depict the West as grittier or more realistic, became more common. Nowadays, revisionist Westerns are the default setting, to the point where the label is almost unnecessary. Think about it, a wholesome Western made 20 years ago would have been laughed out the theatre. A wholesome Western made today would be indistinguishable from parody. To be clear, I'm not attributing this entire titanic shift in public opinion to a single movie. There were plenty of experimental westerns in cinema before Blazing Saddles, and, though they were hard to sneak onto the air, some episodes of serialized television also managed to be quite bold. One that sticks out to me is the Bonanza episode The Honor of Cohees. It deals with a fictionalized and, admittedly toned down, version of the Sand Creek Massacre, even going so far as to mention the government's willingness to poison women and children. At the end of the episode, when the bad guy has to defend their heinous actions, he even does so by combining two separate William Sherman quotes. In theatres, films like High Plains Drifter, which came out the year before Blazing Saddles, were being a bit more experimental with the genre too. The movie stars the dude with no name himself and depicts a world where the quaint, cinematic American frontier town is full of hypocrites, and the man with no name who rides into town is, well, a complete monster. It feels almost like a self-reflexive critique by Eastwood of his 3 most popular movies. High Plains Drifter is, after all, the exact kind of generic moniker his character could have gone by during the Dollars trilogy. In fact, the biggest difference between Blazing Saddles and High Plains Drifter is that Blazing Saddles isn't boring. This is all to say that while there were boundary-pushing, daring westerns before, it was Blazing Saddles' comedic take on the genre that proved a hit. It wasn't just that the film was insightful or astute, it was approachable, hilarious, and infinitely quotable. In my mind, this is why Blazing Saddles was the greatest catalyst in the shift towards revisionist westerns becoming the norm. The people over at Warner Brothers must have felt the same way. Mel Brooks recalls in an interview that even after the movie became a hit, there were people over at the studio who refused to speak with him. He may have made one successful movie, but he shot the cash cow of the wholesome western in the head. This is why when people say you couldn't make Blazing Saddles today, they're right, you couldn't. It wouldn't mean anything because the thing it's parodying is fucking dead. Audiences don't remember or care about the wholesome western, and if they do, they view it as a silly relic of a bygone era, something so self-evidently cheesy it doesn't even warrant parody anymore. Blazing Saddles may be one of the most effective satires of all time for this reason. You couldn't make Blazing Saddles today because the movie did its job. Why would you want to make Blazing Saddles today? Sadly, this fun discussion about a cool movie would be incomplete without addressing the actual argument itself. Most people claim you couldn't make Blazing Saddles today for the simple fact that it's too controversial. It's not PC. You can imagine #cancel Blazing Saddles trending on Twitter. And this argument makes a kind of gut sense. We see online all the time public figures and popular media facing extreme backlash for their perceived failures and flubs, but I think this sentiment misunderstands something fundamental about Western media, namely, who actually holds the power and controls the narrative. But by Western media, I meant, I've just read it and it's confusing. From here, an online stink was raised about movies like 21, Ghost in the Shell, Gods of Egypt, Death Note, The Great Wall, The Lone Ranger, Exodus, Gods and Kings, and Aloha for whitewashing their cast. These complaints and criticisms weren't saved for the first trailer. They were all made the instant casting was announced, and each film could have gone back and recast or even shot their movie to avoid the controversy, but none of them did. This is because whatever outrage these casting decisions generated, the studios involved did not think it would equate to enough lost revenue to go back and recast. Many of them may have predicted the distaste ahead of time, but again, went with what they thought would be the most financially viable decision. In terms of people, Bryan Singer was accused of sexual assault in 2014, but was still given the go-ahead to make an X-Men movie himself. His film Bohemian Rhapsody even won a bunch of Oscars last year. Similarly, Louis C.K. wasn't cancelled for making bad jokes, but for repeated sexual misconduct. All the same, he's about to embark on an already sold-out comeback tour. Paula Deen, who was in the hot seat for racism, is still hosting cooking shows. And Chris Brown, who beat up the most popular musician in the world at the time, with the entire honestly horrifying police report being released online, is still releasing albums and making public appearances. And the reason for this is simple. These individuals have made studios and corporations a lot of money, and they are not going to give up any potential future money unless they absolutely have to. They would rather sink the money into a potentially futile Louis C.K. comeback than give up any hypothetical future earnings. The "you couldn't make Blazing Saddles today" idiom is particularly popular among comedians and my esteemed YouTube colleagues. And to be fair, it makes sense to hear the argument coming from them. If comedy is your entire business, you become particularly susceptible and sensitive to the topic. So much so, I think, that censorship and criticism become easily interchangeable. This is especially true nowadays when criticism is easier to come by than ever before. A comedian's audience is no longer a large nebulous crowd judging them only with their laughter, but a series of distinct faces and names that can respond to them directly via social media. 20 people all telling you a joke is bad can feel draining and demoralizing. But it isn't censorship. All you need to do is search the word triggered on Netflix to be greeted by a deluge of comedy specials, a cornucopia of preview images featuring scowling, screaming, or stony-faced men, each stalwartly guarding their own den of treasures like a dragon at the mouth of a cave. But I do have to ask, does the point ring hollow when all these men are complaining about safe spaces and being unable to make certain jokes, the medium through which they deliver their message being a stage with thousands of people in attendance where they were paid to share their opinions, and then have their opinions broadcast for even more money to even more people on the world's most popular media platform? These 3 videos alone complaining about Blazing Saddles have nearly 1.7 million views. If all these people are being silenced, Netflix and YouTube definitely want you to know about it. On the subject of criticism in stand-up, I like how Bo Burnham once described the power balance between audience and comedian.
But no comedians are being, thrown in jail. They're getting lit up on Twitter maybe a few times. They go through, and that's wrong and maybe bad sometimes. But again, this is from people who have had their opinions heard relentlessly, hours every night, all the time. And then a blogger gets up and expresses their opinion in a blog, and it's like, what? I mean, I don't understand it. How do you not understand that the audience has the same impulse you do?
The anti-PC brand of comedy and viewpoint may feel unique and endemic to the Twitter age, but that actually isn't the case. The first time most Americans even heard the phrase political correctness was in Richard Bernstein's New York Times article, The Rising Hegemony of the Politically Correct, which outlined and complained about the then new curriculum at Texas University. It didn't take long for the idea to go mainstream. Murphy Brown had an episode mocking the curriculum and modern students shortly thereafter.
It was the wrong number. And when I told him it was the wrong number, he said, "Thanks, honey." And I felt victimized.
And we were even getting embarrassing satire like the politically correct night before Christmas, not long after the article's publication. By the way, this piece of shit was read this year in the Royal Albert Hall of all places. Despite being published 30 years ago, the talking points Bernstein's article inspired are still trotted out today, but presented as uniquely modern problems endemic and specific to our current society. 7 years after the rising hegemony of the politically correct, South Park redefined what you could get away with on TV, but those talking points stayed the same. Any random episode of the show is likely to be as, if not more offensive than Blazing Saddles, and South Park has been on the air for 20 years and 300 episodes. What will eventually take it off won't be complaints online, but a decline in ratings, at which point you can expect to see You Couldn't Make South Park Today t-shirts go on sale. And to those who still fear the ineffectual censorship of teenagers complaining on the internet, I do have some genuinely bad news. Despite my facetious tone and comments, censorship and negative pressure due to politically offensive content is actually alive and well in the United States. You see, a movie studio will risk pissing off a bunch of teenagers on Tumblr, and a record label will risk releasing an album by a controversial figure. But one thing neither will do is piss off powerful institutions or advertisers. For example, Saturday Night Live is a show that has released dozens of controversial sketches over the years. Some have come to be forgotten or even maligned, but others have become outright celebrated. Time and time again they were accused of racist jokes and jokes in poor taste. However, in their 45-year history, there is only one sketch they have ever pulled from the air. Fan base than the White House itself. Bill Maher, dickhead though he is, got his show Politically Incorrect cancelled after offending several White House staffers by implying that the US government was cowardly in its use of long-range missiles. At the time, US Press Secretary Ari Fleischer said, "Americans need to be careful what they say and what they do." This year, a movie called The Hunt offended the president himself, who decried the film as racist. Shortly thereafter, the film's release was cancelled. Jim Acosta asked the president a series of questions he didn't want to answer, and in response, the White House edited footage of him to make it look like he was being more aggressive than he was with a member of staff. Though it isn't direct censorship, the US military is famous for only working with movies that make them look good. They will only allow the use of military equipment in films they deem acceptable, in many instances even going as far as to have the final say over the final edit of the film itself. For example, Arrival was only able to have US soldiers be bad guys by specifying they had gone rogue. and were not following orders. You see, the military itself isn't corrupt, it's those darned bad eggs again. My God, they've survived so long. Though you may disagree with their points or find the issues grating, rest assured that companies like Sony, Blumhouse and Comedy Central couldn't care less about an ironic hashtag mocking one of their products trending on Tumblr. The only time they're willing to give up on profits or allow themselves to be censored is when they piss off advertisers, governmental bodies or otherwise powerful institutions. I don't think Blazing Saddles would do that, but I do have to concede something. I think if the movie were made today, it would piss people off, and they would complain about it. That initial gut feeling I mentioned about people lambasting the film for its content, I think there's some truth to it with one major caveat. If you have the time, please go back and rewatch Blazing Saddles, not just because it's an incredibly funny, insightful and influential film, but to answer a question. Who is it that is actually in the movie's crosshairs? Who are we most often laughing at rather than with? What demographic of people are constantly the butt of the film's cruelest jokes? Once you've answered these questions, answer one more. With all that in mind, and considering everything we've talked about in this video, if they did make Blazing Saddles today, who would be the people actually whinging about it most?
Mungo like candy.
Howdy there everybody, thanks for watching this video. Before you do anything, leave a comment telling me whether you think that Life of Wyatt Earp or Buffalo Bill